Indiana, if you're a victim of identity theft and have enough to make that claim, you can go to the circuit court in which you're a resident and file an action seeking to be judicially noticed as a victim of identity theft. Now that court order that claims, that essentially helps prove up that you're a victim has to be recognized with all the creditors that are calling you. We can take actions against people once you've been adjudicated as a victim of identity theft. That's a complete bar from people calling you for collection purposes. And it also helps clean up other records. We can submit that to the three major credit bureaus so we can enforce the court's order in a number of capacities. That's done a remarkable job in the work we've done trying to serve the victims so that they don't continue to have the same problems of re-victimization. So again, trying to work on this as a whole as opposed to looking at all the many parts. The one thing I will say about our work over the past 5 years in dealing with, let's say generally on the whole area of internet fraud, what used to be local crime and random or either 2 or 3 people, we're now seeing much more organized groups. One of the groups that we work most closely with is called FinCEN. So if anybody out of Washington knows the investigative tools that the Department of Treasury has, they are very helpful in our own local efforts because what we find is that the internet fraud criminals are no longer somebody down the street. They're less likely to rifle through your garbage and find your identifiers. They're more likely to be Russians or Eastern Europeans that come over and spend a month on internet crime. So it's become more and more of a organized, well-funded, and I'll say that you're almost impressed with the technology and the use of the resources for criminal purposes. So they're very well educated. They may have gone to Purdue years ago with me, and now they've turned the dark direction. But we do find that we're up against much more sophisticated rings of internet criminals as opposed to the good old days. I hate to say it that way, but back in the days when they were more localized. Again, it's much more difficult for law enforcement to work through Interpol to try to get some check organization than it was when they were in Muncie. On the area of security breaches, this is one area that I think we still have a long way to go. There's an awful lot of information being collected in a lot of companies, and I think in some respects they haven't fully thought through the needs for maintaining privacy and maintaining the security that's required by our statute. In Indiana, we have a very strict notice requirement. Many of you will probably look at each state separately, but in Indiana, again, kind of with our cherished privacy, there's a very strict notice. First of all, you're required to notify the Indiana Attorney General, just so if you have read the statute differently, we'll help explain exactly what the requirements are. There's also a notice requirement of the people whose information could have been compromised. We take these things very seriously, and I used somewhat of the same approach that we did in the early days of Do Not Call. I'll share a story that you can at least interpret any way you'd like. But one of the first cases we took against someone for a serious violation of our Do Not Call statute was up in South Bend. And I went up and argued part of the case myself, especially when the company, the telemarketer, was asking that we, direct appeal to the judge to give him a break, that we were looking for every dollar in terms of the fine. And the appeal to the judge to make me be reasonable and to haggle a deal. And I told the judge that we considered it strict liability, very similar to an auto speeding ticket. So you can argue that you didn't know you were speeding, you can argue that the speedometer's broken, you can promise never to do it again, and you pay your fine. So in Indiana, I said, you know, we're going to have a strict liability, and we'd like the judge to order every penny so that we can use those funds in our do not call enforcement so that they won't be calling the judge and his wife during dinner. But we got every penny from them, and the word went out that Indiana does not consider violations of our privacy as part of the cost of doing business. So I think the same approach, and it's somewhat draconian, but you'll see a pretty strict liability approach to security breaches in Indiana. Again, I recognize that companies are still struggling under the wave of, let's call it the technological advancements that it's hard to keep up with. But again, the word should go out that when you look at all the state regulations on security breaches and the requirements of notice, put a little asterisk next to Indiana because we consider it something that we're going to expect from companies that do business in our state. Let me tell you a little about the problems that we've had. We've done quite a bit of capturing of our own data, dealing with the problems that internet fraud and identity theft cause. The amount of problems that we quantify, most often the information is used for credit card fraud. We've worked very closely with the large companies, the larger banks that deal with credit cards so that we can try to help combat their own problems, which ends up costing all of our consumers when they tack it on to fees and services. But 25% of all the fraud involves a credit card, use of credit in the credit card industry. 18%, and this is a growing area, people are having utility fraud, so they're getting money out of the utility companies and they're paying bills, believe it or not, for their utility. Bank fraud is behind that at 17%. Unemployment fraud, again, using the names of people who are unemployed, that's risen to 12%. Loan fraud, where they seek private loans, is now at 5%. Government fraud is past that now at 9%, with 13% being other. So there's more and more creative ways of using identity theft and internet fraud in kind of the marketplace. Let me just finish with just a few points. The privacy and security breaches that occur in Indiana, come from a number of areas. I think the first is unintentional leaks. So this can come from the people's vendors, human error, which is more and more common, and then unforeseen glitches. So when people change their security, there's gaps, there's information that's posted to their website that's no longer secure. We've also worked with companies that when they do report a problem, there's more and more procedural breakdowns. So we tell people that they should have a procedure in place, that they're willing to come and talk to the regulator, the Attorney General's office. So when you want to come and explain why you've had a security breach, the first thing we're going to ask is what procedures did you have in place? So again, we're trying to work with companies to enforce the idea that best practices, having someone in charge of security of information, and what would you do in the unlikely event of a security breach. So you should have a plan in place that you could implement. So the key that I tell companies is to have a plan ready to go and call us early. Don't start looking like you're trying to implement your own plan and then come to us 90 days later and say, here was the problem, here's how we fixed it, because that's not going to be enough. You need to talk to the Attorney General's office at least before 30 days are out. So I'm not saying that that's